So if you look at the calendar, it is Monday, March 30, 2026. And the world is currently standing on the absolute edge of a cliff.
Yeah, it really is. It's a uniquely terrifying moment in modern history.
Right, because just about a month ago, at the end of February, we saw a massive, completely overt geopolitical shock. I mean, a direct war breaking out between the United States, Israel, and Iran.
Exactly. And the sheer scale of the kinetic destruction was mind-blowing. But, you know, what's actually the most surprising part of the fallout isn't the military action itself.
No, it's not. The most surprising part is who is currently holding the keys to world peace.
Yeah.
Like the one country that is frantically trying to pull everyone back from a third world war and, frankly, a global economic recession.
Right. And that country is Pakistan.
Yeah.
Which I don't think anyone saw coming.
Nobody had that on their 2026 bingo card. I mean, we're talking about an unexpected middle power, a state that is currently surviving on an IMF ventilator, dealing with its own severe internal crises, suddenly acting as the central mediator for the entire globe.
It is wild. And that is the exact mission of our deep dive today. We want to unpack how and why Pakistan has stepped into this massive diplomatic void.
Yeah, and to do that, we're pulling from a really specific stack of sources today. So we've got some peer-reviewed academic journals that look deeply into Pakistan-Iran relations over the 21st century.
We also have this incredibly detailed, brand new policy brief from the Center for International Strategic Studies, or CISS, which is based right in Islamabad.
Right. And we are pairing all of that with some breaking analyses and situation reports from international media. Places like Dawn, Middle East Eye, and the Eurasia Review.
So we're really bridging this gap between real-time, on-the-ground military movements and some very deep, long-term institutional history.
Exactly. Now, before we really get into the weeds here, I need to take a second and lay out a very explicit disclaimer for you, the listener, because the sources we're diving into today contain some highly sensitive, incredibly politically charged content.
Yeah, I mean, we are talking about active military operations, existential conflicts, and some very deep ideological divides.
Right. So I want to firmly clarify that neither I nor the expert are taking any sides here. We're not endorsing any viewpoints from the left or the right. We are not validating any political or military actions, and we aren't judging the morality of any of these actors.
Our only goal today is strict analytical distance.
Exactly. We are here solely to impartially report, unpack, and analyze the ideas and the facts that are contained entirely within this original source material. Nothing more.
Just sticking to what the documents and the analysts are saying.
Right. So with that framework in place, I want to give you a quick tease of just how strange this whole puzzle is. To really understand the crisis right now in 2026, we actually have to look backwards to a secret flight in 1971 that involved a fake stomachache.
Oh yeah, that is a crazy story.
It is. And we also have to look at a brand new, behind closed doors cryptocurrency deal happening right now. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the catalyst for this whole crisis, the event that essentially broke the Middle East.
Yeah, so according to the CISS policy brief, that catalyst happened on February 28, 2026. The U.S. and Israel launched this massive coordinated campaign called Operation Epic Fury.
Epic Fury, which, I mean, the name alone tells you a lot.
Right, and the scale of this was just paralyzing. We are talking about nearly 900 precision-guided strikes in the first 12 hours alone.
Wait, 900 strikes in half a day?
Yeah, in 12 hours. This wasn't just a signaling mechanism or a warning shot. The sources emphasize that this was an explicit decapitation strike. They went after command and control nodes, advanced air defenses, missile silos. But the absolute linchpin of the whole thing was that they successfully killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Wow. And they got him before he could be moved to a bunker, right?
Exactly. And that specific assassination is what analysts are calling the death of managed escalation.
Yeah, let's talk about that term, managed escalation, because for decades, the Middle East basically ran on these grim, unwritten rules.
Right. The shadow war.
Exactly. It was all covert actions, cyber attacks, proxy wars in Syria or Yemen. You know, proportional responses. You could blow up a centrifuge, but you absolutely did not launch a targeted strike to kill a head of state.
But that era is completely dead now. Operation Epic Fury was a war of strategic choice, and the explicit goal was regime change. And the policy briefs debate the timing of this heavily. Because, according to Pentagon briefings cited by CISS, there was actually no imminent ticking time bomb threat from Iran against U.S. forces.
Right, there was no preemptive necessity for it. In fact, if you look at the diplomatic track at the time, There's actually progress being made.
Yeah, there were indirect nuclear talks happening in Oman just days before the strikes. The Omani foreign minister even went on the record saying a deal to stop Iran from stockpiling weapons-grade material was within reach.
But the U.S. abandoned that diplomatic track completely. They issued a 10-day ultimatum, and then they just unleashed these strikes. But, I really have to push back on the logic of this decapitation strategy.
How?
Well, just look at historical precedents in the region. If you look at the U.S. in Iraq, or the NATO intervention in Libya, removing the leader of an autocratic state doesn't just instantly create a stable democracy. It's like cutting the head off a hydra.
Yeah, that's a very fair point.
The state fractures, militias fill the vacuum, and you get a generational insurgency. So why did the architects of epic fury think that killing the Ayatollah would just instantly collapse the Iranian regime? Why did that strategy fail so badly?
Well, the sources argue it was a massive miscalculation of how the Iranian state actually functions. The U.S. planners seemingly treated Iran like a pure personalist dictatorship. Like, if Khamenei is gone, the whole bureaucracy just freezes.
Right, like pulling the plug on a computer.
Exactly. But Iran is deeply institutionalized. It's built on this theological architecture, sure, but that architecture is guarded by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And they aren't just an army.
No, they're a massive economic conglomerate. They run telecommunications, borders, heavy industry.
Right. So when the strikes happened, the state didn't collapse. Instead, this intense institutional continuity kicked in. The bureaucracy moved to protect itself.
So what did that look like on the ground?
Well, immediately, a 3-person leadership council legally took over executive authority. You had President Pezeshkian, who is seen as relatively moderate, sitting alongside the hardline judiciary chief, EJ, and a senior cleric named Ayatollah Arafi.
So they formed a triad to stabilize things. But what about the supreme leader role itself? Because constitutionally, isn't there an assembly of experts that has to choose the next leader?
Yeah, an 88-member body of theologians. But as you can imagine, you can't exactly convene a massive theological debate while 900 missiles are hitting your country.
Right, I imagine that's a bit disruptive.
Just a bit.
Yeah.
So the IRGC just bypassed the Constitution entirely. They non-procedurally elevated Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Ayatollah.
Oh, wow, they just forced him into power.
Yeah, to prevent any street protests or internal factional fighting. Mojtaba already ran the Supreme Leader's office bureaucracy. He had deep ties to intelligence. So the IRGC prioritized ruthless continuity over procedural theology. The Hydra didn't die, it just reorganized under military supervision.
And because it reorganized, Iran was actually capable of launching a massive counterattack.
Right, and it wasn't just a token response. They launched hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones at Gulf bases. They activated aligned networks in Lebanon and Iraq.
But the kinetic stuff isn't even the most impactful part. The immediate response wasn't just military, it was economic. They hit a choke point that affects every single listener of this deep dive. They formally closed the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, this is where the regional war turns into a global geoeconomic shockwave.
Exactly, and I really want to explain to the listener why you should care deeply about this. Because the Strait of Hormuz isn't just some distant waterway. It handles 20% of all globally traded oil.
It's math.
We're talking 25 to 30% of all seaborne crude oil and a fifth of global liquefied natural gas, or LNG. And the fallout was instant. Oil benchmarks surged. Analysts are warning it could easily breach $100 a barrel and keep going.
Which means inflation skyrockets.
Exactly. And it's not just gas for your car. Natural gas is the main ingredient for nitrogen fertilizers. So when LNG is trapped in the Gulf, fertilizer prices spike, and food prices everywhere go through the roof.
Yeah, the sources note that Qatar actually had to suspend its LNG production because they couldn't get ships out, which immediately put a suffocating squeeze on European energy.
It's a total global crisis. But let's bring this back to Pakistan. Because if Europe and the US are feeling the pain, the CISS brief outlines that Pakistan is facing total economic annihilation.
Absolute annihilation. Pakistan gets 81% of its oil from the Gulf. They have very little domestic refining capacity.
And they rely heavily on remittances, right?
Yeah, huge amounts. In 2025, they had over $38 billion in remittances. Nearly half of that comes from Pakistani expatriates working in Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
So if the Gulf is a war zone, the construction in Dubai stops, the service sector shuts down, and that money just evaporates.
Right. The closure of the strait is literally a death blow to Pakistan's fragile economy, which is already surviving solely on an IMF ventilator.
But wait, let me raise a skeptical point here from the sources. If Pakistan is this economically vulnerable, literally on life support, are there mediation efforts actually about this noble diplomatic desire for peace? Or is this just sheer desperation, like a pay-for-peace play?
Well, the Asia Times piece tackles that directly. They explicitly call it more about desperation than diplomacy.
Really? So it's just self-preservation?
Completely. Pakistan needs the oil price to drop, and they need their workers in the Gulf to keep sending money. But honestly, regardless of their motive, the global economy absolutely needed a mediator.
Because the traditional peacemakers had suddenly vanished from the board.
Exactly. The diplomatic vacuum was huge. Historically, Oman has been the principal interlocutor for any U.S.-Iran talks. They have this Swiss-style neutrality.
Right. They hosted the secret talks for the 2015 nuclear deal. So why didn't the U.S. just use Oman this time?
Because Oman lost its neutrality during Operation Epic Fury. The CISS brief details how Iranian drone swarms actually crossed into Omani airspace and parts of the mainland were hit.
Oh, so they were physically dragged into it.
Right. When your sovereign territory is violated, you have to react. Oman issued strong condemnations of the U.S. strikes, so Washington no longer saw them as impartial.
And what about the other Gulf states? Qatar, the UAE?
Disqualified. They host massive U.S. military bases. From Iran's perspective, they are active staging grounds for the enemy.
So that leaves an incredibly narrow list of candidates. You need a country that Iran trusts enough to physically host diplomats, and a country the U.S. trusts to transmit complex demands.
And Pakistan is basically the only option left. They share a 900-kilometer border with Iran, but crucially, they possess absolutely zero U.S. military bases on their soil.
So Pakistan steps into the void, and they bring with them this U.S.-drafted 15-point peace plan, which is just fascinating. The demands are huge.
They really are. The U.S. is demanding that Iran completely dismantle key nuclear sites, like Fordow. They want a total suspension of solid-fuel ballistic missiles.
And they want the Strait of Hormuz reopened immediately.
Yes, in exchange for just partial sanctions relief.
Right, and Iran's counter-demands are just as maximalist. They want full reparations for the 900 strikes. They want an end to all U.S. and Israeli aggression. But the craziest part, they are demanding recognized sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz itself.
Yeah, trying to turn a global choke point into a sovereign toll road.
Exactly. So you have these two completely unyielding positions. How does Pakistan actually manage this negotiation?
They use a system called dual-track diplomacy. This is where Pakistan's complicated internal structure actually becomes an asset. They basically split the job between the military and the civilian government.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like a massive geopolitical good cop, bad cop routine.
That's a great analogy. Field Marshal Asim Munir, the head of the military, handles the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. He speaks the pragmatic, hard power language that Washington understands.
And the civilian side.
Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif handles Tehran. He uses the diplomatic, culturally sensitive language of shared history and neighborly ties.
But wait, can a state actually negotiate a peace treaty when its own internal branches are essentially playing different characters?
It's risky, definitely. There's a huge risk of mixed messaging. But it allows the military to leverage their ties with the U.S. without binding the civilian government to American policies.
And there's a wild modern detail in the sources about how the military is building that trust with the U.S. It involves crypto.
Yeah, the Investing.com report highlights a recent cryptocurrency agreement between the Pakistani government and a firm led by Steve Witkoff.
And he's the U.S. Middle East envoy, right?
Exactly. And this deal was reportedly overseen directly by General Munir. So while missiles are flying, the Pakistani military is facilitating decentralized finance deals with the inner circle of the U.S. administration.
That is surreal. But I guess it speaks the language of transaction. It creates vested economic interests.
Right. But to truly understand why this dual-track method works and why both the U.S. and Iran trust Pakistan enough to engage with these different tracks, we have to look back over 70 years into their history.
Yeah, let's dive into the historical foundations of this trust, because it is a roller coaster. So going back to 1947, when Pakistan is created, Iran is actually the very first country in the world to officially recognize them.
Which establishes this deep foundational narrative of Islamic brotherhood. And for decades, the academic journals call this the golden age of their relationship.
Right, the 1950s through the 1970s, both are anti-communist, both are ruled by a monarchy or military, and both are staunch U.S. allies. They were in CENTO together.
Right, the Central Treaty Organization.
Yeah.
And the level of support Iran gave Pakistan was incredible. During the 1965 and 1971 wars with India, Iran literally acted as a covert weapons buyer for Pakistan.
Yeah, the sources mention Iran buying F-86 Sabre jets from West Germany just to quietly transfer them to Pakistan to bypass arms embargoes.
And the proxy fighter jet swap. The Shah of Iran convinced Jordan to send planes to protect Pakistan, and then sent Iranian planes to protect Jordan.
It's a masterpiece of logistical choreography. But okay, let's talk about the ultimate proof of concept for Pakistan as a trusted back channel. Operation Marco Polo in 1971. The story of Henry Kissinger's fake stomachache.
This is one of the greatest intelligence deceptions of the Cold War.
It really is. So, the Nixon administration wants to secretly open relations with communist China. But they can't just fly there openly. They need a totally secure intermediary.
So Kissinger goes to Islamabad on a public tour, and suddenly he gets struck down by this mysterious, incapacitating stomach bug.
Right. They tell the press he's violently ill and has to recover at a secluded mountain resort. They even send a decoy motorcade up into the mountains.
And the global press completely falls for it. Meanwhile, the real Kissinger is smuggled to an airport, put on a Pakistani commercial jet with a hand-picked crew, and flown secretly to Beijing.
He spends 48 hours negotiating with China, flies back, recovers from his stomachache, and goes on his way.
And it proved to Washington that Pakistan's military could keep a massive, world-changing secret.
Which is exactly why the U.S. trusts them in 2026. They rely on that institutional memory.
Exactly. But on the Iranian side, the history isn't just a golden age of cooperation. The Islamic Revolution in 1979 changed everything.
Right. Iran becomes an anti-Western theocracy, while Pakistan stays a huge U.S. ally. And that leads to the Afghan proxy war in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, Pakistan funneled weapons to Sunni Mujahideen, while Iran backed Shia factions. They were fighting a brutal proxy war.
And it got so bad that in 1998, they almost went to direct war over diplomats being killed in Afghanistan. Plus, the sources mentioned the dark times in the 2000s, like the Joondalup bombings in Iran, which Tehran blamed on Pakistan.
And even just last year, in 2025, they were literally firing cross-border missiles at each other.
Right, so what's fascinating here is if they were literally bombing each other just last year, how on earth does Iran trust Pakistan today?
Well, it's about how that 2025 crisis ended. The de-escalation was incredibly rapid. It proved to both sides that neither state actually wanted a real protracted war.
So they looked over the edge of the cliff and both agreed to step back.
Exactly. And that established a very precise baseline of pragmatic trust. Iran knows Pakistan doesn't want a war on its western border, and Pakistan knows Iran fears a two-front war. That mutual understanding is the exact foundation needed for 2026.
Okay, so that explains the state-to-state trust. But Pakistan isn't just a military headquarters, it's a massive society. And to mediate externally, Pakistan has to survive its own internal sociological crucible.
And the internal pressures in Pakistan right now are just immense. The sources really dive into the sectarian demographics.
Right. Pakistan has the world's second largest Shia population, over 50 million people.
So when Ayatollah Khamenei is assassinated by the US and Israel, it's not just a foreign policy issue for Pakistan. It triggers massive collective trauma domestically.
The sources describe massive protests erupting in Karachi, Lahore, Gilgit-Baltistan. It got so violent that the U.S. consulate in Karachi was physically breached.
Which forces the military establishment into a really terrifying dilemma. Field Marshal Asim Munir actually had to issue a blunt warning to the country's Shia clerics.
Telling them their loyalty has to be to Pakistan, not Iran.
Right, because the military's ultimate fear is something called horizontal escalation. Historically, Pakistan's doctrine of strategic depth was about keeping its western borders stable so it could focus on India to the east.
But now that doctrine is turned inward.
Exactly. They are terrified that the interstate war between the US and Iran will spread horizontally across the border and ignite sectarian civil war inside Pakistan.
Which brings up this really fascinating psychological dissonance within Pakistan's identity that the sources highlight. The tension between the begging bowl and the nuclear sword.
Yeah, this is such a crucial dynamic. On one hand, Pakistan has this deep shame over its massive poverty and its reliance on foreign aid, the begging bowl.
They're constantly asking the IMF or Gulf nations for bailouts.
Right. But on the other hand, they feel immense fierce pride in being the Islamic world's sole nuclear power. That's the nuclear sword. It represents sovereignty and strength.
But I have to push back on this because the sources say the U.S. actually wants Pakistan to use its nuclear status to convince Iran that they don't need to build a bomb. Like, hey, if we reach a peace deal, our nuclear umbrella will protect you.
Yeah, that's the U.S. strategy.
But isn't that wildly hypocritical? The U.S. is using one nuclear-armed state to tell another state they shouldn't seek nuclear weapons. Why would Iran ever buy that? Doesn't Pakistan's survival just prove to Iran that they need a bomb?
Oh, absolutely. The critics call this strategy ludicrous nonsense for exactly that reason. The messaging is entirely contradictory, but in the brutal reality of international relations, hypocrisy doesn't really matter.
What matters then?
Capability. Pakistan's nuclear status gives it undeniable security credibility. When Pakistani diplomats sit across from the IRGC, they can't be bullied or intimidated by military threats. They are a heavily armed equal.
So Iran has to respect them.
Right. And that security credibility is exactly why Pakistan was able to transition from just being a messenger to actually assembling a brand new coalition to force a ceasefire.
Let's talk about that coalition, because this brings us right up to the present week, March 29 and 30, 2026. 4 foreign ministers are gathering in Islamabad: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt.
The CISS policy briefs call this the new stabilization axis.
It's an incredible group of middle powers stepping up because the traditional great powers have totally lost control.
Right. You have Saudi Arabia bringing Gulf wealth, Turkey bringing NATO ties but independent relations, Egypt bringing intelligence networks, and Pakistan anchoring it all with access to Tehran.
But before they could even announce this access, Pakistan had to debunk some massive myths and rumors from the fog of war.
Yeah, there was severe disinformation in the early days. Rumors were flying around that Pakistan actually allowed the U.S. to use its airspace or even its intelligence for the decapitation strike against Khamenei.
Which would be catastrophic for their mediation. How do you even prove a negative in a war zone?
Pakistan had to aggressively push back. They held technical briefings showing the U.S. strike packages came through the Gulf and Iraq, not Pakistan. They pointed out the U.S. used stealth platforms that Pakistan's aging radar couldn't even track.
They had to protect their moral standing at all costs. Because if Iran thought they were complicit, the backchannel dies instantly.
Exactly. They also had to deal with the lingering anxiety in the West over the Islamic bomb myth.
Right, to the legacy of the AQ-Khan proliferation network from the 90s, where Pakistan secretly sold centrifuge tech to Iran and North Korea.
The U.S. had to be absolutely convinced that Pakistan's nuclear command and control is locked down today, and that they are acting as a stabilizer, not a proliferator.
So once they clear the air, what is the actual roadmap? The CISS policy brief gives Pakistan a very specific 4-step plan.
Step 1 is international. Lead a UN General Assembly resolution for a ceasefire.
Why the General Assembly and not the Security Council?
Because the Security Council is paralyzed by vetoes. The U.S. would veto anything blaming Israel. Russia would veto anything blaming Iran. The General Assembly bypasses that great power gridlock to mandate a fact-finding mission and create maritime humanitarian corridors.
Smart. What's step 2?
Build an interministerial economic task force. This is purely domestic survival, monitor currency markets, beg the IMF for emergency forbearance, and scramble for non-Gulf LNG contracts so the lights stay on.
Step 3 is maintaining absolute strategic autonomy.
Right, which means absolutely refusing to join any formal military blocs. They have to condemn violations of international law no matter who does it.
And step 4?
Lead a regional security dialogue. Once the shooting stops, bring Iran, the Gulf states, and international stakeholders together to hammer out non-aggression pacts and revive nuclear diplomacy.
It sounds great on paper, but does this actually work in reality?
Well, we have a glimmer of hope. A proof of concept just happened.
Right. The sources confirmed that as a direct result of Pakistan's backchannel, Iran agreed to release 20 Pakistani-flagged commercial vessels that were trapped in the Strait of Hormuz.
Now, 20 ships is tiny in the grand scheme of global trade. It doesn't fix the oil crisis.
But it proves the channel works.
Exactly. It proved to Washington and global markets that Pakistan can actually extract physical concessions from the highest levels of the IRGC.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, how do political scientists actually categorize what Pakistan is doing here?
The academic sources apply 3 different international relations theories. First, realism, which basically says this is all about cold, calculated state survival. Pakistan is just aggressively hedging to keep the oil flowing and the IMF money coming.
Right, sheer desperation. Then there's constructivism.
Right. This theory says Pakistan is trying to project a new identity. They are actively rebranding themselves from a volatile, struggling state into a moderate, indispensable anchor of Islamic world peace.
And the third theory is the darkest one, critical theory.
Yes. Critical theory suggests Pakistan is using this external diplomacy to mask severe internal repression. By playing the global peacemaker, the military can crush domestic dissent, like the Shia protests, and frame it purely as foreign-backed security threats during wartime.
It's totally possible all three are happening at once. But what happens if they fall into the strategic squeeze? What if Washington and Riyadh force Pakistan to honor their defense pacts and actually pick a military side against Iran?
If that happens, the mediation fails and the projections are grim. We'd likely see the Pakistani state fracture into civil war as the Shia population revolts against a state fighting their theological center. Plus, millions of Iranian refugees would pour across the border into Balochistan. The regional collapse would be catastrophic.
So what does this all mean? We've seen how a decapitation strike fundamentally altered the Middle East. We've seen how the global economy was essentially taken hostage in the Strait of Hormuz. And we've seen how Pakistan, driven by this crazy mix of historical trust and desperate economic survival, stepped into the void.
They're trying to stop World War III with backchannel crypto deals and a deeply divided government.
And I want to remind you, the listener, that this isn't just distant geopolitics. This mediation effort is literally the barrier standing between you and an unprecedented global economic recession driven by soaring gas and food prices.
It really is, and the sources leave us with a final, profound thought to mull over. We're watching a massive shift in global power. For decades, superpowers dictated the terms of peace.
Right.
But in an era of fractured multipolar chaos, perhaps the most vital currency isn't military dominance. It's simply the capacity to be trusted by enemies. If a state on an IMF ventilator can prevent World War III, we have to ask, is the era of the superpower over and the era of the intermediary state just beginning?
That is the defining question. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep exploring the complex layers behind the headlines, and we'll catch you next time.